Some people spend a lifetime chasing respect. Others earn it in silence, only to be forgotten until the right person remembers. The lunch crowd filled the old diner just outside Fort Liberty with the comfortable noise of ordinary life. Forks tapped against porcelain plates. Coffee steamed beneath warm amber lights. Waitresses drifted between tables carrying baskets of fresh bread while conversations overlapped into a familiar hum. It was the kind of place where soldiers, retirees, truck drivers, and local families crossed paths every afternoon, each convinced they understood the people sitting around them. At precisely 12:17, the front door opened with a soft chime. An elderly black man stepped inside. His movements were slow but steady, each step deliberate, as though every stride carried memories invisible to everyone else. He wore a neatly pressed navy blazer despite the summer heat, polished brown shoes that had clearly seen many years, and a faded black cap embroidered with two simple words, U.S. Veteran. Pinned beneath the cap's brim was a small bronze insignia dulled by time. Most people never noticed it. The hostess glanced up with a polite smile that faded almost immediately as her eyes drifted across the crowded dining room. "I'm sorry, sir," she said gently. "We're almost full." The old man answered with a warm nod. "I don't mind waiting." His voice carried no bitterness, no disappointment, only patience that seemed older than the building itself. The hostess scanned the room again. There were empty chairs, quite a few of them, one beside a businessman reading financial reports, another across from two young professionals scrolling through their phones, one at a family table where only 3 of 6 seats were occupied. Yet as her eyes met theirs, something subtle happened. The businessman quietly placed his briefcase on the empty chair. The young professionals slid their jackets across the vacant seat without exchanging a word. A mother gently pulled her little daughter closer and whispered something too softly for anyone else to hear. Within seconds, every available chair had somehow become unavailable. No one raised their voice. No one said anything cruel. No one had to. Sometimes rejection arrives wrapped in perfect manners. The hostess forced another apologetic smile. "I'm really sorry." The old veteran simply nodded again. "It's all right." He walked toward a narrow wooden bench near the entrance and lowered himself onto it with visible care. One hand briefly rested against his knee before settling upon an old leather satchel worn smooth from decades of use. He looked around the restaurant without accusation. Children laughed near the window. A young couple celebrated what appeared to be an engagement. Televisions mounted above the counter replayed sports highlights no one seemed to watch. Life continued exactly as if he weren't there. A little boy at a nearby booth stared curiously beneath the brim of the veteran's cap. "Dad," he whispered. The father never looked up from his phone. "What? Why is that soldier sitting alone?" His father shrugged. "Finish your fries." The boy wasn't satisfied. "But there are empty seats." Before anyone could answer, the front door swung open once more. A gust of warm Carolina air swept through the diner. Conversation slowed. Several active-duty officers standing near the register instinctively straightened. A tall man entered wearing a perfectly tailored civilian suit, but nothing about him looked ordinary. His silver hair was cropped with military precision. His posture remained impossibly straight despite the years carved across his face. For polished stars gleamed quietly on the lapel pin attached to his jacket, small enough to escape casual attention, unmistakable to anyone who had ever worn the uniform. General William Carter. Even those who didn't recognize his face immediately sensed the authority that seemed to move with him. The manager hurried forward. "General Carter, what an honor. Your usual table is ready." The general acknowledged him with a brief smile, but his eyes were already searching the room. They passed over officers, families, businessmen, waitresses. Then they stopped. His expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough for someone watching carefully to notice that time itself appeared to hesitate. Across the room, sitting quietly on the wooden bench with weathered hands folded over an old leather satchel, the elderly black veteran slowly lifted his head. For one long heartbeat, neither man moved. The restaurant continued breathing around them, unaware that history had just recognized itself. General Carter took one silent step forward, then another. Every conversation faded into uncertain whispers as dozens of curious eyes followed him. No one understood why one of the highest-ranking military leaders in America was walking past every reserved table, every waiting guest, every greeting extended toward him. He wasn't walking toward honor. He was walking toward the man everyone else had quietly chosen to ignore. General William Carter ignored the manager's outstretched hand. "I'm afraid your table is over here, sir," the manager said politely, gesturing toward a private corner reserved long before his arrival. The general never even looked in that direction. His polished shoes carried him across the dining room with quiet purpose, each measured step drawing more attention than any speech could have. The conversations around him faded one by one. Forks stopped halfway to waiting mouths. Coffee cups hovered above saucers. Even the televisions seemed strangely silent beneath the growing weight of curiosity. The elderly veteran remained seated on the narrow wooden bench. He watched the distinguished officer approach with calm, unreadable eyes. There was no excitement, no attempt to stand, no expectation that someone of such rank would even know his name. Why would he? 46 years had passed. 46 years had a way of turning heroes into strangers. General Carter slowed as he reached the bench. For a brief moment, he simply looked at the old man. His eyes settled on the weathered face marked by time, the faded veteran cap, and finally the bronze insignia resting above Elijah Brooks' left eyebrow. Recognition flashed across his expression, not the recognition of fame, but something far deeper. Memory, pain, gratitude, regret. The general inhaled slowly. "So, it really is you." Elijah offered a gentle smile. "I was wondering how long it would take." Several diners exchanged confused glances. "You two know each other? Who is that old man? I've never seen him before." The whispers spread from table to table like ripples across still water. None of them understood why one of America's most respected military leaders suddenly looked less like a commanding officer and more like a young lieutenant standing before someone he deeply admired. General Carter removed his gloves with deliberate care before placing them inside his jacket pocket. His posture straightened even further. Instinctively, respectfully, almost ceremonially, Elijah noticed the movement and shook his head with a faint chuckle. "You don't have to do that anymore, Bill." The name caught several retired officers nearby completely off guard. Bill. No one called a four-star General Bill. No one except someone who had known him long before the stars decorated his shoulders. General Carter smiled, though his eyes had begun to glisten. "I still do." A long silence settled between them. Not an awkward silence. The kind shared only by people who had survived something together that words could never fully explain. The manager finally stepped closer, visibly confused. "General, should I prepare another table?" Carter turned toward him. His voice remained calm, yet carried unmistakable authority. "No." He pointed toward the empty seat beside Elijah. "I'll sit right here." The manager hesitated. "But, sir..." General Carter looked around the dining room. His eyes drifted from one face to another. The businessman who had covered an empty chair with his briefcase. The family that had quietly pulled away. The young professionals pretending not to stare. He noticed every one of them. Then he spoke softly enough that no one expected the words to carry across the room. "Funny." A brief pause. When this gentleman walked in, everyone suddenly ran out of room. Another pause. "I've spent half my career trying to become the kind of leader this man already was." The restaurant fell completely silent. No dichis clatereth. No phones bust. No one dared interrupt. Somewhere near the window, the little boy tugged gently on his father's sleeve once again. "Dad!" His voice barely rose. Above a whisper. "Who is that soldier?" His father finally looked up. For the first time since they arrived, he had no answer. The little boy looked from General Carter to the elderly veteran, searching for an answer that none of the adults seemed willing to give. His father lowered his eyes. For the first time that afternoon, the phone in his hand no longer mattered. General Carter gently pulled out the empty chair beside Elijah and sat down without hesitation. It was a simple gesture, almost ordinary. Yet inside that quiet restaurant, it carried the weight of a ceremony. The waitress, Sarah Mitchell, approached cautiously with 2 menus. "General, may I bring you today's special?" Carter smiled politely, but shook his head. "I'll have whatever Sergeant Brooks is having." Sarah blinked. "You know his name?" "I've known it for nearly half a century." The words settled over the room like snowfall. "Sergeant, not Mister, not Sir. Sergeant." The title immediately changed the way many people looked at the elderly man. Some leaned closer. Others quietly searched their memories, wondering if they should recognize him. Elijah let out a soft laugh. "You still remember my rank. I remember much more than that." Carter's voice carried no trace of military command now. It sounded almost like a son speaking to the man who had shaped his life. Sarah returned moments later with 2 cups of fresh coffee. As she placed one in front of Elijah, she noticed his hands. Scarred, thick, weathered. They were not the hands of an old man who had lived comfortably. They were hands that had carried impossible burdens. Hands that had worked. Hands that had fought. Hands that had saved lives. Without thinking, Sarah quietly whispered, "Thank you for your service." Elijah looked up with the same gentle smile he had offered everyone else. "Thank you for remembering." Across the dining room, the businessman slowly removed his briefcase from the chair beside him. The young professionals folded their jackets onto their laps. The family near the window exchanged uncomfortable glances. Nothing in the restaurant had physically changed. The empty seats had always been there. Only now did everyone realize who had created the distance. General Carter wrapped both hands around his coffee mug before speaking again. "You know, Elijah," he paused, choosing his words carefully. "I've attended state dinners. I've stood beside presidents. I've been honored in rooms filled with generals from around the world." He looked directly into Elijah's eyes. "But sitting here beside you," his voice grew quieter, "means more than any of those moments." No one moved. No one interrupted. The silence itself had become part of the conversation. Elijah lowered his gaze toward the worn leather satchel resting beside his chair. "I never expected anyone to remember." General Carter answered immediately. "I never forgot." The words struck with unexpected force. Not because they were loud, because they were true. Near the entrance, an elderly retired Marine slowly stood from his table. Without saying a word, he removed his own cap and held it respectfully against his chest. A second veteran followed, then a third. One by one, former servicemen throughout the restaurant quietly rose to their feet. No one instructed them. No one announced a ceremony. Respect simply spread from one person to another until nearly half the dining room was standing. The little boy watched with wide eyes. He tugged gently on his father's sleeve again. "Dad!" This time his voice was filled with wonder instead of confusion. "What did that soldier do?" His father stared at Elijah for a long moment before answering softly. "I don't know." Then he looked toward General Carter. "But I think we're about to find out." General Carter slowly reached inside his jacket. For a moment, everyone expected him to pull out a phone. Perhaps an old photograph. Maybe a military document. Instead, he removed a small leather wallet, worn smooth around the edges from decades of carrying it. He opened it with careful hands. Tucked behind his identification was a faded photograph, no larger than a postcard. The colors had almost disappeared. The corners were bent. Tom had tried to erase it, but had failed. Carter laid the photograph gently on the table and turned it toward Elijah. "I've carried this with me for 46 years. Elijah looked down. A smile, quiet and bittersweet, crossed his face. "I can't believe you still have it." Sarah, unable to hide her curiosity, glanced toward the picture. Several nearby diners leaned forward as well. The photograph showed a group of young American soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder somewhere deep in the jungle. Their uniforms were stained with mud. Their faces looked exhausted. Most of them couldn't have been older than 23. Near the center stood a young black sergeant. Strong shoulders, confident eyes. One arm rested protectively across the shoulders of a nervous young lieutenant. General Carter gently pointed toward the lieutenant. That scared kid. He smiled softly. Was me. No one spoke. The businessman who had refused to share a table now found himself staring at the photograph, as though seeing history for the first time. Carter's fingers slowly moved to the young sergeant. And this man, his voice became almost reverent, is Sergeant Elijah Brooks. The room remained perfectly still. Elijah chuckled quietly. I had more hair back then. Laughter spread through the restaurant. Not loud laughter. Gentle laughter. The kind that eases tension without breaking respect. For the first time since Elijah entered the diner, people smiled because of him instead of looking away from him. General Carter smiled as well. You also had the habit of making impossible situations look easy. Elijah shook his head. No, I just did what needed to be done. Those simple words hung in the air. No boasting, no dramatic speech, only quiet humility. Sarah looked at the photograph again. Was this taken during Vietnam? Carter nodded. 2 weeks before everything changed. He stopped there. He offered no further explanation. Not yet. Instead, he slipped the photograph back into the wallet with extraordinary care, almost as if returning a priceless treasure to its rightful place. The little boy near the window raised his hand shyly. Excuse me, General. Carter turned with a warm smile. Yes, son. Were you and Sergeant Brooks best friends? The general looked at Elijah before answering. No. Another pause. We were brothers. The answer sent another wave of silence across the room. Some truths needed no explanation. Military veterans understood immediately. Others simply felt the weight behind the word. Brother. Not by blood. By sacrifice. By trust. By surviving what countless others never came home from. Elijah lowered his eyes toward his untouched coffee. I lost track of everyone after the war. General Carter nodded slowly. I spent years trying to find you. You disappeared. I thought maybe you wanted to forget. Elijah's smile faded just enough to reveal something deeper. You don't forget a war. He gently rested one hand on the old leather satchel beside his chair. You just learn how to carry it. No one noticed that his fingers had tightened around the worn handle. No one except General Carter. And in that small, almost invisible movement, the general realized something that everyone else in the restaurant had yet to discover. The greatest story about Sergeant Elijah Brooks had not begun with the medals he wore. It had begun with the scars he never talked about. General Carter rested both hands on the table. For several seconds, he said nothing. His eyes remained fixed on Elijah, as if asking permission to reopen a chapter that neither man had spoken about in decades. Finally, Elijah gave a small nod. You've carried it long enough, Bill. The general took a slow breath. It was September. His voice was calm, but every word seemed heavier than the last. Our platoon had been moving through the jungle for 3 days. No sleep. Very little food. We were all exhausted. The restaurant had become so quiet that even the kitchen staff stood motionless near the serving window. Every pair of eyes was now focused on the two veterans. I was 24, Carter continued, fresh out of officer training. I knew the manuals. I knew the maps. But I didn't know war. He smiled sadly. I thought I did. Elijah lowered his eyes. We all thought we did. Carter nodded. Until that morning. His fingers tightened around the coffee mug. Our unit walked straight into an ambush. No one interrupted. No one reached for a phone. The room seemed to understand that. This was not entertainment. It was testimony. Gunfire came from every direction. We couldn't even tell where the first shots had come from. I froze. The admission surprised many people. This was a 4-star general, a man celebrated for courage and leadership. Yet he spoke about fear without shame. I wish I could tell you I acted like an officer. I didn't. I stood there. I couldn't move. Across the table, Elijah remained silent. His expression never changed. The general looked directly at him. Then Sergeant Brooks did. Sarah unconsciously leaned closer. The little boy at the window had stopped eating entirely. Carter's voice softened. He didn't stop to think. He didn't ask for orders. He ran toward the danger. Several veterans in the restaurant slowly lowered their heads. They knew exactly what those words meant. He reached me first. I remember him grabbing the front of my vest. Then Carter smiled faintly. He wasn't very polite about it. Elijah chuckled. I probably called you something that wasn't in the Army handbook. The room filled with gentle laughter once again. You did, Carter replied. You absolutely did. The laughter faded naturally, giving way to silence once more. General Carter looked around the diner before continuing. You've all thanked me for my service. I appreciate that. But the truth is, he turned back toward Elijah. I wouldn't have had a military career. I wouldn't have become a general. I wouldn't have met my wife. I wouldn't have watched my children grow up. I wouldn't be sitting in this restaurant today. Another pause, because I would have died in that jungle. The words struck the room with breathtaking simplicity. No dramatic music. No raised voice. Only truth. The businessman slowly removed his glasses and wiped his eyes. The young professionals looked down at the tables they had refused to share earlier. Even a manager stood speechless. General Carter looked at Elijah one more time. Everything people respect about me. He shook his head. Started with one decision made by this man. Elijah smiled with quiet humility. You remember it differently than I do. Carter frowned. Gently. How do you remember it? The old sergeant stared into his untouched coffee. After a long silence, he answered with the same calm voice he had used all afternoon. I remember the men who never came home. And in that instant, everyone realized that the greatest heroes were often the ones who spoke the least about themselves. No one spoke after Elijah's words. I remember the men who never came home. The sentence lingered over the restaurant long after his voice had faded. It was as if every person inside had suddenly become aware of something larger than themselves. General Carter looked down at the table. There were 11 of us in that patrol. Elijah quietly corrected him. 12. The general looked up. A faint smile crossed Elijah's face. You always forgot to count yourself. For the first time that afternoon, Carter laughed through eyes that had begun to fill with tears. You still correct me. Some habits are worth keeping. The warmth of the moment spread gently through the room. Even Sarah smiled as she quietly refilled their coffee cups without interrupting. After a long silence, Carter asked the question he had carried for decades. Why did you disappear? Everyone listened. The answer seemed almost sacred. Elijah leaned back slowly. When I came home. He paused. The war ended. Another pause, but not for everyone. His eyes wandered toward the front window, where sunlight reflected against passing cars. Some men came home to parades. Some came home to families. Some came home carrying things nobody else could see. He rested one hand against his chest. I carry mine. The room remained perfectly still. No one needed him to explain further. Pain often speaks most clearly when it whispers. I worked construction. I drove trucks. I fixed roofs. I raised my daughter. I buried my wife. Each sentence was short, simple, honest. A lifetime compressed into a handful of quiet words. I didn't need anyone to remember my name. General Carter slowly shook his head. But the country should have. Elijah answered with the same gentle smile. The country doesn't owe me remembrance. It owes every young soldier the chance to. Come home. Those words struck even harder than the story of the battlefield. The businessman lowered his head. The manager quietly removed the small American flag decoration from the counter and placed it respectfully beside Elijah's table. Not for display, for gratitude. Sarah wiped away a tear before pretending to organize silverware. Across the room, the retired Marine who had stood earlier finally spoke. I served 2 tours. His voice trembled. I've been waiting 30 years to hear someone say exactly that. Another veteran nodded. So have I. One after another, quiet voices joined the conversation. Not telling stories of medals. Not comparing achievements. Simply remembering names. Friends. Brothers. People who never returned. For a few extraordinary minutes, the diner stopped being a restaurant. It became a place of remembrance. General Carter opened his wallet once more. This time he removed a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. I've carried something else. He carefully unfolded it. It was an old roster. The names of every soldier from that patrol. Some had small stars written beside them. Some did not. Only one name had been underlined in faded blue ink. Sergeant Elijah Brooks. I looked at this list before every promotion ceremony. Carter's voice cracked, to remind myself that every star on my shoulders belonged to people who carried me before I could carry anyone else. Elijah stared quietly at the paper. Then he reached across the table and folded it shut. You honored them. He looked directly into Carter's eyes. That's enough. But General Carter slowly shook his head. No, Elijah. It isn't. He stood from his chair. His expression changed, not into that of an old friend, into that of a four-star general preparing to do something the entire restaurant, and Elijah himself, would never forget. General Carter stood slowly. The scrape of his chair across the wooden floor echoed through the silent restaurant. Every conversation had stopped. I followed him. Elijah looked up with quiet curiosity. You don't have to do this, Bill. The general answered without hesitation. Yes. Edo. He stepped back from the table until there was enough room between them. Years of military discipline settled naturally into his posture. His shoulders squared, his chin lifted, his breathing became steady. The veterans around the room recognized the transformation immediately. This was no longer a friend speaking. This was a commanding general honoring someone he believed history had overlooked. The little boy instinctively stood beside his chair. He did not know why. He simply felt that something important was about to happen. General Carter looked directly at Elijah. His voice carried across the restaurant with calm authority. Sergeant Elijah Brooks. The formal address immediately changed the atmosphere. Every veteran in the room straightened. Every civilian fell completely silent. For 46 years, I have worn these stars. He touched the insignia on his shoulders. People have thanked me. They have saluted me. They have called me a hero. He slowly lowered his hand. But every honor I have ever received rests upon the courage of men who expected nothing in return. His eyes never left Elijah. You were one of those men. A deep silence followed. Then, with perfect precision, General William Carter raised his right hand. He saluted. It was flawless, sharp, unwavering, not rushed, not symbolic. A full military salute offered from one soldier to another. The restaurant froze. Sarah covered her mouth. The manager instinctively removed his cap. The businessman stood without realizing he had done so. Elijah stared at the general. For the first time all afternoon, words seemed to fail him. You don't salute retired sergeants, he said softly. General Carter never lowered his hand. I salute the man who taught me what leadership looked like before I ever understood the word. A single tear rolled down Elijah's cheek. He quickly wiped it away, embarrassed by the attention. You always hated people making a fuss. Carter smiled. This isn't a fuss. It's long overdue. Behind them, the retired Marine quietly came to attention. Then another veteran. Then another. Within seconds, every former service member in the restaurant stood side by side. Without a command, without an announcement. One after another, they raised their hands in salute. Some were Marines. Some were Army. Some Navy. Some Air Force. Different uniforms. Different generations. One gesture. Respect. The civilians watched in stunned silence. No one had organized it. No one needed to. Honor has a language that requires no instruction. The little boy looked at his father. Can I stand too? His father swallowed hard before answering. You don't have to salute. He placed a gentle hand on his son's shoulder. But you can stand. Together they rose. Soon every person in the restaurant was on their feet. Some placed their hands over their hearts. Others simply stood quietly. No one wanted to be seated while an entire lifetime of forgotten service was finally being recognized. Elijah slowly rose from his chair. His knees trembled with age. General Carter immediately stepped forward, ready to help. Elijah smiled and gently waved him back. I've stood on my own this long. He straightened his old jacket. Then, despite the years, despite the scars, despite the weight he had carried for nearly half a century, Sergeant Elijah Brooks returned the salute with steady dignity. In that unforgettable moment, the stars on a general's shoulders and the faded cap of an old black veteran no longer represented different ranks. They represented the same thing. Honor earned, never demanded, finally remembered. For several long seconds, neither man lowered his salute. The room stood with them, silent. Still, respect had transformed an ordinary afternoon into something that no one present would ever forget. General Carter was the first to lower his hand. Not because tradition required it, because emotion finally did. He stepped closer to Elijah and extended his hand. The old sergeant looked at it for a moment before smiling. No, the general looked surprised. Elijah opened his arms instead. We've earned something better than a handshake. A quiet laugh escaped Carter. So we have. The two men embraced. Not with the stiff formality of decorated officers. Not with the excitement of young soldiers reunited after a deployment. But with the quiet gratitude of two old friends who had survived long enough to meet again. The restaurant erupted into applause. Not loud, not chaotic, steady, heartfelt. The applause continued until even Elijah shook his head in embarrassment. You all are making me wish I'd ordered dessert first. Laughter swept across the room. The tension dissolved into warmth. Sarah smiled through tears. I think dessert should be on the house. Before Elijah could answer, the manager stepped forward. No, he cleared his throat. Not just dessert. He looked directly at Elijah. Your meal. Anything you want. It's our honor. Elijah smiled politely. I appreciate that, but I'd rather pay. The manager hesitated. Please, Sergeant. Elijah gently interrupted him. I've spent my whole life paying my own way. Another quiet silence settled over the room. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his worn jacket. He carefully removed an old leather wallet. Its edges were cracked. The stitching had faded. It looked almost as old as the memories they had shared. He placed a few neatly folded bills on the table. General Carter watched him with admiration. You never changed. I tried not to. The general smiled. I noticed. The little boy slowly approached Elijah's table, holding a small paper American flag that had been sitting near the cashier. He stopped a few feet away. His father remained behind him, allowing the moment to belong to his son. Sir. Elijah turned. Yes. The boy held out the little flag. I think it belongs with you. The restaurant became quiet once again. Elijah looked at the child, then at the tiny flag trembling slightly in his hand. Instead of taking it immediately, he asked gently, What's your name? Ethan. Well, Ethan. Elijah knelt carefully despite the stiffness in his knees until they were nearly eye to eye. This flag doesn't belong to me. He gently folded the small stick back into the boy's fingers. It belongs to all of us. The child looked confused. But General Carter said you're a hero. Elijah smiled. He was being kind. Then he pointed toward the people standing throughout the restaurant. The nurse who saves lives. The firefighter who runs into danger. The teacher who believes in children. The parents who raise them. They carry this flag too. The little boy looked around the room with new understanding. General Carter quietly whispered, That's exactly why I saluted him. Because even after everything he had endured, even after war, even after loss, even after being forgotten by strangers only an hour earlier, Sergeant Elijah Brooks still believed that honor became greater the moment it was shared with someone else. And in that simple lesson, everyone inside the diner received something far more valuable than a story. They received a new definition of what greatness truly looked like. The afternoon slowly returned to its ordinary rhythm. Coffee cups were refilled. Plates were cleared. The front door opened and closed as new customers wandered inside, unaware that they had just stepped into a place forever changed by what had happened there. Yet something felt different. The restaurant seemed quieter. Kinda, as if everyone had agreed, without speaking, to carry a little more respect into the world than they had brought with them. Elijah reached for his veteran's cap. He brushed a thumb gently across its faded brim before placing it back on his head. The fabric was worn. The stitching had loosened with time, but he wore it with the same quiet dignity he had carried throughout his life. General Carter picked up the check before Elijah could. The old sergeant smiled knowingly. I thought we settled this. We did, Carter replied. You said you'd pay. I never said I'd let you. Elijah laughed. You're still impossible. I learned from the best. The manager quietly folded the receipt in half. He looked at both men. It has already been taken care of. Elijah frowned. I told you. The manager shook his head. It wasn't the restaurant. He pointed toward the dining room. Every customer had quietly contributed. Some had added $1, some 20, so much more. No one had signed a name. No one wanted recognition. Only gratitude. Elijah looked around the room. People smiled back, not because they expected anything, but because for the first time that day they truly saw him. He slowly removed his glasses and wiped his eyes. I don't know what to say. Sarah smiled gently. You already did. You reminded all of us. Outside, the afternoon sun cast long golden light across the sidewalk. General Carter walked beside Elijah toward the entrance. Neither man hurried. At the doorway, they paused. Across the parking lot stood a weathered pickup truck. Its paint had faded. Its tires had seen countless miles. Just another old truck to anyone passing by. To Elijah, it was simply home for the drive back. General Carter looked at it and smiled. You still drive the same kind of truck. It still gets me where I'm going. They stood together for another quiet moment. Then Carter asked softly, May I visit you sometime? Elijah answered without hesitation. My door's always open. The general nodded. I've lost 46 years. I'm not losing another one. They embraced one last time. No cameras. No reporters. No speeches. Only two soldiers honoring a friendship that war had forged and time had finally reunited. As Elijah climbed into his truck, the little boy named Ethan ran outside with his father. Sergeant Brooks. Elijah rolled down the window. Ethan smiled brightly. When I grow up, I want people to remember me the way they remembered you. Elijah looked at the child for a long moment. Then he answered with the simplest words he had spoken all day. Don't spend your life trying to be remembered. Spend it giving people a reason not to forget kindness. The truck pulled away slowly. Everyone watched until it disappeared beyond the trees. Only then did General Carter quietly whisper, There goes the finest soldier I have ever known. Years from now, the people in that diner would forget what they had ordered for lunch. They would forget the weather. They would forget the date. But none of them would ever forget the afternoon when an old black veteran walked in unnoticed and walked out carrying the respect that had always been his. Because true greatness never demands attention. It simply waits for someone with enough character to recognize it. And when that moment finally comes, justice does not make noise. It stands. It salutes. And it remembers.